as if just about half of you either did take a look at the archived version of the talk we did before on this, or actually heard it last time. And we did ask for people to submit questions. But it was also clear from a number of the questions that many people hadn't seen this. So what I'm going to try to do is walk through some of the basic information very quickly. And if things are not clear, or if I'm going too quickly at some point, please raise your hand and type in a question, and I'll try to address those. It is a relatively small group, so I think we can, given the limits of this kind of setting, we can try to be as informal and just flexible about how we handle this as possible. So what I'd like to do is first just draw your attention to the fact that much of what I'm going to be talking about today is addressed in this resource that's available for download on the JED Foundation website. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of how this came to be, but not spend, again, too much time on this. But just to make sure we're all more or less on the same page, while there were some schools that did have either behavioral intervention teams or at-risk student teams before Virginia Tech, clearly the tragedy at Virginia Tech was a game changer in terms of really highlighting to schools both the importance of having these kinds of programs and the need for this kind of program. One of the most powerful conclusions to come out of the reviews of the Virginia Tech tragedy. And, for those of you working in college counseling or college student affairs, which I assume is almost everyone on the line, reading the governor's report, which if you just actually Google governor's report on Virginia Tech, there's a tremendous amount of useful and interesting information in there about how college counseling services and how college administrations can think about doing this kind of work. There are a number of extremely useful appendices in the report. It's really an excellent effort to at least make some small positive light out of an obviously horrifying situation. But one of the main themes that emerged again and again is that there were large numbers of people on campus through this whole tragic unfolding of events who knew a lot about Mr. Cho and had grave concerns about him over really a period of time. Unfortunately, people were so frightened about various elements of the law, and in many cases misunderstanding various elements of the law, that it really constrained them from taking steps they really could have to try to intervene and address this before it reached the level of tragedy that it did. There are, in fact, some states, Virginia not surprisingly among them, who have in fact mandated campus teams. The problem is that while these teams have been mandated, nobody's really given clear direction about what the content is. So actually this question, I think, was one of those submitted. There really are no standards. There are no federal standards. There are no state standards. And this is going to come through again and again as we discuss this. This standard basically is, what in law is referred to as a reasonable person standard. You have to behave reasonably, or the flip side or flipped way of saying that is it's really not good to behave stupidly in handling a situation. But really, there's a lot of latitude. I think the Department of Education, who are the people who basically oversee the concerns in these areas primarily, really, I think, has a fair degree of understanding that these are very challenging situations, and we're still all working these things out. The one thing to know about the resource is that it doesn't really prescribe very specific things, and again, we'll quickly give you an overview of the kinds of issues that are taken up in this manual or guideline. So, just a word, the project is not an independent project of the JED Foundation. We took the lead in writing this, but it was actually done as a group effort by a group called HEMA, which is an umbrella organization of all of the higher ed, mental health, and student affairs groups, or at least many of the major ones. The participants in HEMA you can see on this slide. It really came about because there was a sense that there were a lot of people who were in this area who were doing similar work or had similar areas of concern, and there was no organized way of really connecting everyone. So again, this theme of connecting the dots comes up again, that the organizations really got together. There's a meeting once a year at one of these organizations' annual meetings. Actually, HEMA just met last week at the American College Health Association annual meeting. And in fact, just for people's interest, the next project that we're going to be looking to work on is to produce a postvention guide, again, along the lines of what we've done with the Behavioral Intervention Teams guide. Okay, so the people who helped contribute and oversee this project, you can go back and take a look at. And the guide will quickly talk about these issues and, again, really try to focus on, I think, the areas of concern, particularly around the legal issues, and both liability and confidentiality issues, I think, are the major concerns that many people raised with this. So it's just to frame this. All right, let us then not use this polling. Again, we're using the slide deck from the talk that we gave originally, but I am going to go through it much more quickly. There are two real streams of thinking in the way these teams are organized, and I think it's important to recognize that they're not mutually exclusive. So after Virginia Tech, not surprisingly, there was a real push in many schools to create teams that focused very specifically on threat assessment and threat identification. The problem is that there really, again, are not very widespread and clearly defined routines for doing that. And the second problem, of course, with that is that, fortunately, actually, these issues don't come up so often on campus. So the concern, while running the teams that had a very specific threat direction, could be very efficient. You can work with a relatively small team. You're not dealing with so many incidents. Actually, some of that is the downside. The smaller the team, the less likely you're going to get access to good information. And with a small number of incidents occurring, you also run the risk that the team really doesn't have an opportunity to practice and become experts in dealing with the kinds of information they ought to be. So again, the threat assessment model is very streamlined. It's not too labor intensive. It's very focused, and it has all of those benefits. It has the downsides of sometimes not having much to do, and as a result of that, the teams really don't develop a body of experience that allows them to be as effective they otherwise might. The other important question, so the other group of teams really looks at a much broader swath of information around really looking for students who are at risk. And schools have defined this differently. Again, you can think about what makes sense on your campus. There's not a one-size-fits-all prescription for doing this. So at smaller schools, you can really kind of cast actually a very wide net in the sense of looking at students who are struggling academically. So I know of one school, because I actually helped construct this program, where any student whose GPA dropped more than 0.5 in a semester was brought to the committee's attention. Now, something wasn't always done about it. Sometimes it was simply, someone was thinking that he or she would major in chemistry and realized after beginning that it really wasn't for them, and that sociology was the way to go. And as a result of that, got a D in a course that they really couldn't handle. If there was a simple explanation, there was nothing more to do. But again, some of these committees cast a very wide look at the campus in the thought of trying to capture any student who may be struggling. Now, obviously, if you're in a school with 40,000 people, the ability to do that is much more challenging, although there are some ways, if you can look at subdivisions or groups of students, that you can do some of this. But you also need to do this a much larger group of people and getting input from much wider directions in order to make this happen. The upside of this is that you have a greater chance of catching problems before they become crises. So intervening at a much lower threshold, or at least collecting information on a much lower threshold, allows you to get in and possibly take steps sooner. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going through the details of this. You can, again, have access to the slide deck. And I've really focused on the two views of campus teams. But just in general, every team that's doing this, the important concepts, the important themes to look at is making sure that you're getting information early on in order to prevent problems from going unnoticed and falling through the cracks. And this really implies the importance of connecting disparate pieces of information. When one advisor notices a concern about somebody who, again, may be struggling in an individual class, it's obviously very different from the situation where you're getting information from 3 or 4 people on campus who've been witnessing agitated or in other ways troubling behavior on the part of a student. So again, these teams allow you to bring this together. So this is, again, a question about the scope of the teams, and really compares these two approaches. So I've talked a lot about this, and as I said before, I'm going to try to go through this rather quickly, and you can go back and look at this. If people have questions about these things, we can go back over them, but I don't want to belabor them for the half of you who've already heard this presentation. Okay. So still looking at the mission and purpose. It's really important, though, for the campus to be clear when they set up a team about which of these models they're using, and it's important to recognize that some campuses do a kind of dual model where they have a much wider defined, broad focused team, but in specific those small number of situations where there's a concern about a student and in terms of being a threat to the campus, they will then actually activate the sub-team or subcommittee that will step in and really take the more threat assessment focus to things, which is, as we've said, different from the way the more general at-risk team may work. Now, with these two distinctions, with these two approaches in mind, it makes sense why these teams have different names. And there were a number of people who asked about naming the teams, and you can see here that there was actually, it's amazing what people study. There was a study done looking at the different names that schools have used. What seems to be an essential element of having a team is that you have to have some kind of clever acronym for your team. Otherwise, the name just doesn't work. You should actually, kidding aside, be a little bit thoughtful about that, because you don't want to create a team that has a name that is a sort of insulting or comical or problematic acronym. Actually, Greg Eels, who is the director of counseling at Cornell, has a number of names that are not part of this list that lead you into some problematic acronym corners. So just be mindful of the fact that even though you may think you're using the full name, people will use the acronym, so they ought to not be troublesome. But the name should reflect the mission of the team. So if the team's focus is less focused on threat assessment, then you shouldn't use that kind of language in your team's name. If it is more student support at risk for students, then that would be what you would try to highlight. Obviously, these are all out there, and you can freely, I think, use these. Okay, so Elizabeth Gould is saying they call theirs bait, which is, I guess, good in areas where people like to fish. For behavioral assessment and intervention team, okay, that one is not on the list, I think. There's a BAT. Okay, behavioral assessment, but you've got also intervention in there. So you see, there's a wide array. You can pick and choose. And the important thing is that it's consistent and reflects what you're trying to do with your mission. There really isn't any other meaning beyond that that you really should put into thinking about the names. Okay, so those are the. We've already got Elizabeth answering the question we haven't asked yet, but let's run through this quickly so that we can so that we can get really more towards your questions. So there were some people who asked about who should be on the teams, and this will give you a sense of what the representation is. So in almost every case, the Dean of Students or VP of Student Affairs, the reason that number is lower is because different schools call those same people the same thing, or different things. So some schools refer to the Chief Student Affairs Officer as the Dean of Students. Other schools use VP of Student Affairs. It's almost inevitably the case, and should be the case, that the Chief Student Affairs Officer should be on the team, and in most cases will be the director of the team, or the chair of the team, because in some ways that person is best positioned to get information from the various constituents who might have a concern about a student. And there are the other logical candidate for directing the team is the counseling center director. The problem with that is that it raises extra concerns about confidentiality of information in the counseling service. There are ways to manage it. So it's not impossible to have the counseling center director running the team, but it does create certain kinds of concerns, and it may actually raise student concerns about whether information is being shared. If word is around the school that the counseling center director is running this team, it may really make students uneasy about sharing certain kinds of things in the counseling service that they shouldn't be worried about sharing. Very often, again, in residential campuses, housing directors are very important people to have input from, because they're literally seeing the students where they live. And, so again, for residential schools, the RAs, the dorm counselors, and dormitory staff are major sources of information. Okay. Okay, so Becky is mentioning here that in the California community colleges, definitely have the health service director or health service representative. So yeah, so health service directors are also important because, again, it's important to keep in mind that, first of all, many students who are coming into the health services with physical complaints are either also suffering from substance abuse or emotional issues, or in many cases, it's actually those sorts of issues that are bringing them to the health service, but students are choosing to identify the problem as a primary care or medical problem rather than an emotional problem. And again, in many cases, it's important to recognize that the health service director may be the director of all of the health system, in which case they also oversee the counseling service. That actually, in terms of chairing the team, is not terrible if the person, you know, really has a skill set that works to be working in this area, has comfort with emotional issues, because it's very often the case that the health service director is really in a more administrative rather than in a direct patient services role. So they're valuable people. They're seeing certainly, especially in non-residential campuses, a lot of students who may be in distress. Although, again, in non-residential campuses, many students living at home are getting their health care through family and home-based resources. So you really have to, again, look at your campus and think about who are the players who make sense to both have on the team, and think about who makes sense and who's the least constrained in terms of sharing information, and we'll talk again a lot about that as we go along. Questions about having the university legal counsel. Let me back up for one second. Having someone from the disabilities office is also a very, very useful addition. In many cases, people from that office, the leadership of that office, have a really good handle on issues that are coming up on campus problems. Students who may be struggling might have actually come into that office. Depending on the nature of the campus, you see the list of people who could be participants. You're really looking for people who have day-to-day personal interaction with students, so that, you know, the kinds of people that we often refer to as gatekeepers, who are seeing students where they live and having personal interactions where they may be able to observe and intervene in ways that are helpful. There are different ideas about whether or not it's good to have legal counsel on the committee. In many places they don't, because it changes the nature of the conversations. If legal counsel is there, the discussions that take place in the course of the team discussions may become then protected information. There may be constraints that apply. Probably also a good idea not to look to the legal counsel. You know, in general, in these kinds of student affairs and counseling sorts of issues, the campus lawyer will be in a position to tell you what lines you shouldn't go over, but I think when they're around, we all tend to look to them for guidance in terms of what to do, and they often aren't in the best position to offer guidance as to what actions to take. They're much better at telling us what actions we shouldn't take or where we might be crossing a line that could get us or the university into difficulties, but they often are not really well positioned to say what we should do. So it's just something to keep in mind. And especially for the teams that have a bit more of a threat assessment, risk assessment model, it's a good idea to have connections to the community law enforcement, and this is particularly true, I would say, if your campus is primarily non-residential, because many of the students will be living in the community, and it's an important series of dots to connect, and also having connections to healthcare resources out in the community for even the more general student support directed committees can be very, very useful if students need referrals out into the community for medical care. All right, so that's, we talked a little bit about team leadership. Senior student affairs were the most common, and as we've said, that makes sense. Certainly other people can do it when there are other things that make sense for that particular campus. Okay, there were some questions that came up too about any of this. Well, maybe we should stop here and just, are there any questions so far? Anything that in this regard that we've missed just in terms of mission and naming and participation? Let's give people a minute to just type in any concerns, and then we'll quickly forge on. And I apologize if I'm speaking New York speed, but I don't want to belabor this for people who've already been through it. Okay, so it seems like, Amy, right, remember everybody other than me apparently is on mute, so if you'd like to ask a question on the phone line, you can do that by pressing *6. Okay, Mary, please mention the group that we're... Well, sure. I mean, it's certainly interesting, and actually, this raises a question. Okay, so let's do one at a time. One of the people who did send in a question asked about student representation on a team, and I think by and large you probably don't find this, although we need to differentiate between having information input from students. It's important that students across the campus, certainly student leaders, and as Mary Jane mentioned, having students who are involved in mental health and wellness outreach activities. If there's an Active Minds chapter on campus, it's certainly important for student leaders who are in a position to know about concerns to have access to the team. So it's important that communication flow should be easy into the team, and in order to have that happen, students need to be aware of it. All right, so this is a very important thing to consider. One other thing to just keep on the radar here is that some of the schools that have a more threat assessment kind of model will also work with their faculty and staff in terms of bringing in reports about them as well, since obviously it's not only students who can be a risk to the campus. Obviously other people can be as well, and in fact, you know, those of you who are well, it's certainly true of anybody. There's almost no one who has a completely secured, walled-off campus. I mean, this is obviously an issue with Virginia Tech, which I think is is over something like 100 acres and has 100 buildings, and with public roads going through them. Those of you who are in urban campuses are liable to the same kinds of concerns. And actually, Gene Dysinger, who is the Assistant Chief of Police at Virginia Tech, who interestingly is also a clinical psychologist, has pointed out that if you really look at crime statistics at colleges, the greatest risk in terms of serious violent crimes are former employees. So, you know, and the scenario of disgruntled and angry employees is in fact a way greater risk to campuses than active students are. So again, this brings up the importance of having connections to local police, local law enforcement, and for the more threat assessment directed teams, you may want to have representation, and probably should, from your HR departments, and if there's an employee assistance program, they ought to be folded in as well. All right, so we're getting a number of people who are writing in with various suggestions about who's in their programs. And in fact, I recently heard that some schools use consultants on an as-needed basis, so that, and you know, for some schools that don't have necessarily all of the on-campus resources, I heard of a large public university that has a forensic psychologist. So they have a very broad-based team that does sort of student at-risk concerns, you know, very generally. But when they break off into their small sub-team of threat assessment, they will sometimes call on a local forensic psychologist who they feel is simply more experienced in really doing the more threat assessment-y kinds of stuff. Okay. So again, we see a number of student health services seem to be, and I suppose the thought there is that these are probably the senior health official on campus, and that certainly is a reasonable way to go. So again, we'll quickly walk through just thinking about what is it these teams are doing. Well, you know, before you actually get started, if you're setting up a team, there are certain things you should do. The first thing is to look at school policies and how they may impact on how the team does its business. And see things like leave of absence policies, medical amnesty policies, you know, whether students are brought to disciplinary action if there's an alcohol or substance issue and they call for help, things like that, involuntary withdrawals, misconduct. I mean, you want to make sure that you have a system in place that addresses on a policy basis the kinds of issues that come up. Sometimes things, as you start to look through these policies and procedures, you know, as we've said in a number of settings, some of these things exist simply because that seems to be the way they always existed, and it's not a bad idea anyway from time to time to review some of these things and see if they need to be updated, if they actually make sense. Thanks to all of you who are sharing your team membership. But, you know, sometimes for various reasons the policies and procedures are where they are, but the team should be aware of them and educate themselves in these things. And the team really needs to go through some training. You know, I see from the list of the participants that those of you are sharing, when you think about it, the head of the counseling service, the head of student affairs, if you have the head of campus safety and security, and maybe even some faculty representation, which some schools do, there'll need to be some cross-training. And it's really important to do this so that people are, even if they're not speaking the same language, at least understand each other's assumptions and languages. You know, administrators often want answers while clinicians are much more comfortable sitting with ambiguity and uncertainty. And these groups can really kind of clash with each other. If there isn't some discussion beforehand and a period of time really getting to know how each other operates and how each other thinks about situations. A number of people, Brian Van Brunt, who a couple years back was the president of the American College Counseling Association, has written some things on this and makes a very good suggestion that it's helpful to actually practice before the team starts to go out into the field and really take on real-life situations. It's a great idea to do some scenarios. He's got some stuff written on that. I think that we have that as a resource at the end of this slide deck if anybody wants to see that. It's also in the resource that he's developed around that I think is referenced in the Campus Teams Guide that's on our website. Okay, so we've talked about frequency of meetings in terms of the different models, but you know, you need to think about having meetings often enough that the team stays fresh and you know, knows how to handle stuff and is really experienced, but not so often that the team's overwhelmed. Some of this, again, will depend on both the focus of the team and on how big your campus is. So once your team is set up and has practiced and is ready to go, obviously What the teams are doing are collecting information and bringing information in, discussing it, monitoring situations, assessing things, and developing an action plan. And while, in many guides or many discussions of this, you're going to see things that look like this is a linear process, it completely isn't. So it's important to recognize that you need to be flexible about this. But as information comes in, and again, depending on the nature of your campus, this might be a phone call, it might be someone on the team has gotten some information, someone else has brought information to the team through a well-defined phone line, or again through identifying that there's going to be a chair of the team who is responsible for trying to collect information. You want to be then connecting the dots. You want to assess the information that you have, find out whether there are other things going on, and do other people have observations or concerns about a student that may be relevant, and then develop an action plan. All right, so it's not enough to just develop an action plan. And I'm going through these quickly because you can go through the specific elements of this. You really need to be coming up with information and with a plan that you can follow up with. You have to think through who's going to take responsibility. There should be in almost every situation a case manager who's going to either try to get more information, have a conversation with the student, and then come back to the team with information about, where do things stand and what are the outcomes. Okay, and it's important to just notice that we don't want people looking per se for, students who are showing signs of mental illness. That although if you have the broader student at risk or student of concern team, it's great to know what students on campus are struggling. But for those of you who are doing a more threat assessment approach, having concerns about mental illness per se doesn't really add to your understanding of someone being a threat to the community. Okay, so it's important to recognize that what the community is looking for, what team members are looking for, are troubling behaviors, changes in student functioning that would indicate some kind of difficulty. Students who used to go to class regularly who have now kind of dropped off the radar and no longer going to class. Students who seem to be, falling asleep regularly when that wasn't the case. Students who seem agitated in ways that are, angry, threatening, challenging. But the key issue is looking for change. Okay. So it's important to keep in mind that these teams have multiply directed activities. So this is a little bit like working in an emergency room in the sense that, obviously the first concern is the health and safety of the student. But you also are looking at the health and safety and care of the community. So these issues need to be always both kept on the radar and kept in balance with each other. But, since we are doing these teams at universities, we're also looking, hopefully, at the broader psychosocial issues that the student may be struggling with, and also the educational outcomes for the students. I mean, our feeling is that if students are doing better and are receiving support psychosocially and emotionally, that there's a greater chance that they're going to succeed educationally as well. We certainly know the reverse to be true, that students who are struggling with anxiety, depression, and substance abuse have a much, much greater likelihood of not successfully finishing their programs. And the groups, again, always have to be cognizant of the legal ramifications of what they're doing. All right, so now let's take another pause for a moment if there are any questions. I know I'm covering a lot of ground very quickly, but I want to leave us enough time to spend on the legal issues. So if anyone wants to either unmute themselves by hitting *6 or type in a question, we can take a minute to do that.
Hello, this is Jane Conway from Palomar College.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, and I was wondering, I've seen some schools divide up into different team functions because of the breadth of all these issues and availability of staff and other functions that they need to perform.
Yeah. Well, you know, again, you can do it. So there are many different models. So there are schools that will do the more student supportee group and then have a separate threat assessment team. Some schools treat them as the threat assessment as a subcommittee. But, I mean, the fact is that you really can think about them having somewhat different personnel involved. So the student support and emotional concern team doesn't really need to have public safety representation. So you can certainly run them as two separate entities. The one thing, though, that you should consider when you have the separate committees is not to lose sight of the connecting the dots problem. You don't want the two separate committees not having some capacity to be able to communicate. So while you don't need all the same people on those committees, it's probably not a terrible idea for there to be one or two people who are cross-members of both committees so that stuff doesn't fall through the cracks, and especially in the threat assessment area, stuff that really could make a very serious difference. So your administrative structure is less important than just thinking through how you can be sure, as you say, not to overburden the same group of people coming to, you know, a million different meetings, but at the same time making sure that you don't have information flow gaps in the system.
Right.
Okay?
Yes. And the second question has to do with the information flow.
Yeah.
And we've currently procured a secured email line for communication.
Yeah.
Could you address using that, or do you find that effective with...
Yeah, I think schools are doing that. I mean, and I think it's helpful. There's a lot of differing opinion out there about record keeping. There are ramifications in terms of what's written down, obviously, and what isn't. So, for example, just a simple legal ramification of that is that FERPA has no restriction of sharing behavioral observations about students. So if an RA reports to the housing director, if you're a residential school, or an advisor, anyone reports to the dean of students just in a verbal conversation, I'm really concerned about Joey. That's not a FERPA-protected communication. Once somebody puts something in a note, whether it's online or written on a piece of paper, it then raises FERPA issues. Now, that isn't necessarily an impediment to the team doing its work. You just need to be aware that that's the case. So certainly record-keeping, whatever format, there's no reason to include gossip, random observations. You really need to recognize that once you're putting stuff in writing, it's discoverable. You should be thoughtful. You certainly need to make sure it's secure. So you need to make sure that your online system is indeed unhackable to, whatever reasonable extent these things can be. I know that there are schools that are using a variety of commercial programs for these kinds of things, and I think it's okay. You just need to be thoughtful about what's written down. Action plans should be written, pretty fairly objectifiable observations should be written down, and follow-up plans. I mean, it's important to recognize, again, that when a team has talked about a student, made a plan, thought about who's going to intervene or meet with a student, then the information has to come back, and there needs to be a review of, was the intervention helpful? Is the situation, going to continue to be observed? Are things resolved? Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe it wasn't. But sure, you ought to be keeping some records in a way that the flow of activities can be tracked, and some of those online programs do that very well. That was a long-winded answer to a much simpler question, but sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk. We've already begun to touch a little bit on some of the legal ramifications. So let's spend some time. Is there a list? I don't know, Christine, but probably, I suspect that probably without tracking it, I've heard the name of the, and I'm not endorsing or not endorsing, I just heard it from somebody who I think is a reliable person, a program called Maxient, which is, I think, a program that's used by legal affairs offices for tracking this. But I'm sure a little bit of looking around, you could probably track this down. I tend to be a pretty low-tech guy, so when I've been involved in this stuff, I've basically kept a little folder locked up in my office because that's just the way I go. But again, there are people I think who are using and they're reliable programs. I just don't know of any other than that name, which I think I'm remembering and reporting correctly. So there are a number of concerns about how this information is shared and what are the legal ramifications of sharing information and the legal limits. So let's set the stage a little bit with a little bit of information. First thing is there's a lot of fear of FERPA and fear of HIPAA. So HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It is really a law that refers to medical and mental health clinical information. And in fact, it almost never applies in college health or mental health settings. Okay, Emily is telling us about the advocate program through Simplicity. Okay, so there we are. And that's the other problem with some of these programs is that they are costly, and a folder and a notebook is very cheap. So HIPAA is a non-issue, both in general in college campuses in the health setting and mental health setting, unless your school is submitting insurance claims online, which is a real rarity. I mean, in very, very few cases does anything like this occur. So we can put HIPAA aside. In fact, what we need to be cognizant of is mostly medical and mental health information on college campuses is limited by the state laws applicable to medical information and also the professional codes of conduct of the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, the nursing and social work associations. All of those have strict limits, and mostly state law is driven by a consensus of those things around what kinds of things can be shared. And obviously, clinical information in a mental health setting has a higher index of confidentiality than even other medical information. And we should understand that that's actually something that makes sense for people to come in and share very private things about themselves. In a clinical mental health setting, they need to feel confident that it's not going to be in the local newspaper the next day or, on the local TV station. So there needs to be a real sense of confidence about confidentiality for therapy to actually be able to work. So again, it's something that we shouldn't take lightly or for granted. Now, administrators and other kinds of educational systems are answerable to FERPA, which is the Family Educational Records Privacy Act, if I'm not mistaken. So FERPA, again, dictates that for most college students who are adults who are over 18, in general, the school administrators, school staff members cannot just call up a parent and say, did you know that Joey got a C in his English essay, right? So once a young person is an adult, technically, which most of our students legally are, their educational records are protected by FERPA. So, that sounds like it's limiting, but there are a couple of important things to be aware of in relation to FERPA. One is, as I said before, there are a number of exceptions to FERPA. One is, for example, that behavioral observations, not written down, just shared one person to another on campus, is not limited by FERPA. Second important limitation, or exception to FERPA, is that if there is a legitimate educational interest in sharing information, then that information is able to be freely shared within the university. So one faculty member is certainly not constrained from calling up the dean of students and saying, Joey, I don't know why Joey is always the one in trouble, but that's the way it is today. Joey seems to be falling asleep in my class, and I've had him before, and he was a really good student. I'm worried. There's a legitimate educational interest in that exchange happening. So there's absolutely nothing in FERPA that would stop anyone from being able to do that. FERPA also has an explicit exception for health and safety emergencies. So if there is an imminent or direct concern about the safety or health of a student, or a student's behavior having a specific impact on other students, FERPA in no way limits the ability of a person to communicate with an appropriate person. You can't, again, just call up the local newspaper, right? So FERPA doesn't allow you to do things that are negligent or silly, but if you're taking sensible steps to contact someone who is in a position to intervene in a helpful way or ought to know about a situation, you're completely not constrained by FERPA from having those kinds of communications. So what this leaves us with, and by the way, there are other sort of loopholes, and even if someone is over 18, if parents are still taking a young person as a dependent on their income tax, actually the parent then is entitled to information. FERPA then may not apply to them, but you probably won't know that. Actually, there are some schools after Virginia Tech that began to routinely ask students that on their registration information, so that they would, be able to tell whether they could contact parents in a complicated situation. You don't need to get into that. One important thing to be aware of that occurred after the Virginia Tech tragedy was that the Department of Education, recognizing that there was so much misunderstanding about and fear about FERPA, put out a statement that is somewhat well known, basically saying that they're not going to second guess schools if you use prudent good judgment in communicating with someone. If you're worried about a student, you call up the dean of students or somebody appropriate on campus, and it turns out it wasn't such a big deal, it wasn't a problem. They're not going to second guess a school as long as you have a reasonable rationale for taking the action that you did. So the Department of Education has really taken steps not to loosen FERPA. I mean, it really gives you the latitude to do the things you need to do in order to safeguard and protect the student, again, as long as you're acting thoughtfully and sensibly and not acting in ways that are sort of obviously and grossly negligent or silly. So there is no reason to be afraid of FERPA. The other important thing is that there's no personal liability for a breach of FERPA, so that if the head of your housing office or an academic advisor mistakenly, really the student has done nothing, there's no problem, they're perfectly fine, but something gets misinterpreted and something untoward happens, there's no personal liability for that, no cost liability, no professional liability. What can happen is if the student brings a complaint to the Department of Education, the school can be censured. The worst case scenario is that school can lose federal funding. In fact, it's never occurred. So again, while I'm not suggesting that we be cavalier, FERPA is a very sensible law. It has, sort of reasonable latitude for people to do sensible things, but it certainly isn't something that we ought to go around being afraid of. The one thing that's important to note in this kind of 7-8 minute overview of the legality of communications on campus is that administrators and non-clinical people have a much greater latitude to share information than clinical people. So FERPA gives you a lot of wiggle space. While students who are in treatment at the counseling service or at the health service, the information that is available to those people, whether it's the clinician that's working with the student or the director of the counseling service, that's protected by a much more rigid state, usually series of state laws. And the thresholds for breaching confidentiality in the clinical setting are much higher. So there you really need to be in the realm of a kind of imminent health and safety emergency. Just worth noting, since we're a California audience here, that the classic law about the limits of therapeutic confidentiality, the Tarasoff case, which is now about 30 years old, was an incident that happened at, I believe, UCLA, and it was in a California college setting that this principle was established that if there's a direct threat to another person, a psychiatrist can breach confidentiality, and pretty much some version of the Tarasoff standard is what most states have in place in terms of limits of sharing information. Now, again, with some of the recent shooting incidents, states have looked at loosening some of those things, but it's still more or less the Tarasoff standard is that. So what that raises is that the counseling service people who are on these teams may not be able to share information they have about a student if they don't believe that the student really is manifesting a significant risk to the community. What role they can actively play as a consultant in helping to elucidate what steps might be prudent and when it might make sense for there to be a referral to counseling for a mandatory assessment, which, again, some schools do. Sometimes when there's a mandatory assessment, some schools prefer to do those off campus because of the confusion of roles. They prefer their own counseling services on campus to be seen only in a purely helpful and student treatment context, and sometimes they simply don't have people who can do the sort of assessment that would be necessary to really determine whether a student may be a risk to the community. So I hope that's clear. I know I threw a lot of information at you, and maybe, again, it's a good time to stop and just make sure we're all on the same page and everybody understands all of this stuff I've just dished out to you. So let's take a minute, and people can, again, *6 or type in a question if any of this is not clear. Because I think it's important stuff, and there is a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of fear about it. Wow, can it be that I was that clear? Okay. It's hard to imagine. All right, let's give people who maybe as slow typers as I am a chance to think. But again, if it's a complicated question, maybe easier to just do it over the phone so that we can all hear. No? All right. Well, we're all good. Okay. So I've alluded to this a little bit, but liability concerns are often also a question. So the question would arise, well, these teams are looking at, we have a question we have a few questions. Okay, for FERPA emails to members of the BIT team, should password, you know what, yeah, we really, we need to be careful about emails. So if you are emailing about a student, either it's a good idea not to use the student's name if there's a way of, if you know that you're following a certain number of people, and there are only 2 or 3 people on the radar, use initials so that it can't be easily identified in case the email winds up in the wrong person's inbox. Or, using password-protected email is certainly a good idea. You have to be cognizant about these records being kept in a safe and carefully secured place. And remember that emails are not your property; they're actually the university's property. If you're on a university email system. In fact, if you're on like Gmail or something, the emails are the property of Google and not private. So emails are not a private and necessarily secure mode of communication. So certainly good to be cognizant of that. Are there models of communication between departments? I think a lot depends on the structure of your school. You can find descriptions of information flow in the manual. And what we did is we spoke to a couple different schools and really almost gave kind of flow charts and grids. It's just important that people know who the players are within the system in the school, and know it's important that there be multiple ways into the system. You want to have a flexible and well-publicized enough system that people know who to be calling. And really the way that the communication happens between the departments is ideally in the context of the team meetings. If there's something more urgent than that, obviously the members of the team could be communicating not in the context of the meeting, but over the phone, or, if there's a way of doing it in a fairly safe and secure way over email. But good idea not to be, overusing that stuff unless you have a pretty good and secure system to do that. I hope I answered the question. Again, in terms of FERPA, you really can do a lot of things as long as you're not negligent or silly about it. There are no FERPA police who are looking to get you into trouble. So I think everybody needs to really kind of take a deep breath and not worry nearly as much about FERPA as we do. You really need to think about what makes really good, common, thoughtful sense in the way you do things. All right, and I think just going back to the liability question, and this slide that has been up now for the last 10 minutes or so, I think really addresses that. Nobody is expected to be able to anticipate or predict the future or know what's going to happen. This is a nice quote here, that the law doesn't require campuses to predict the future. You have to use reasonable care. That's pretty much the standard. And it's important for people to know, there are really very, very, very few lawsuits around these kinds of issues, around campuses responding to situations or campus mental health. If you look through, as we have, really things come up in most cases when just something has been handled so obviously badly, so that a student who says they're suicidal and no action whatsoever is taken, and a senior administrator knew about it, that's just that's obviously a bad idea. But it's also important to recognize that there's no state that has said that colleges have a legal obligation to prevent either suicide or danger to others beyond what any general citizen. So the way the law talks about this is whether colleges have a special relationship with their students. And consistently, any time in the handful of cases that have come up in this regard, state courts have essentially said that there's no special relationship, that colleges have no more obligation to, legal obligation. Let's be very clear. I mean, you might have a moral and ethical obligation, and it may still be an excellent idea to do what you can to be helpful. But the law doesn't expect us to do this or demand that we do it. We're doing it because it's the right thing and the sensible thing to do, and it's part of our responsibility towards the people that we're trying to help educate. But the law doesn't expect us or demand even that we provide medical or mental health care to students. You're not obligated to have a counseling service on your school campus, right? I mean, most schools are doing it because they know that it's a good idea and it helps more students succeed. But I don't think there's any state that has obligated schools to provide these services. So the legal threshold for all of this stuff is very low. As I've said a couple times, the law expects you not to be stupid. And most of us aren't. Sometimes in the course of a crisis, we do things that might not be the best thing. But consult with colleagues. I mean, it's good to have connections. I mean, so programs such as these would give people an opportunity to share information and share concerns with each other are a good way of dealing with that. Have a couple people on your contacts where, if there is a concern on your campus, get an opinion from somebody outside the situation. And it's also why it's a good idea to have walked through and practiced and looked at a couple of scenarios and thought about what kinds of things can come up and how you might handle it. That said, you're never going to anticipate the thing that actually comes up, because the real-life situations are always stranger than the things that you'll anticipate. But at least to have thought through and practiced, you can say to yourself that you've taken the important, prudent steps that you need to prepare yourself. Okay, so I think we've talked about almost all of these things, and we have a little bit of time. We talked about that, and we've talked about FERPA, and we talked about, how about that? Okay, so there's been some concern. Some of you might know about the fact that the Office of Civil Rights some time ago put out a direction that basically said that schools can't put a student on a mandatory leave just because they're a direct threat to themselves, and a lot of administrators got very worked up about this. In fact, what this letter said was completely nothing new. So let's just think about for a moment the fact that we know that 6 to 8% of college students in a given year will report that they have significant suicidal ideation. At the same time, we know that there are about 1,000 students who report suicidal ideation for every student who goes on to die by suicide. So for a long time, the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education have recognized that just because a student may say that he or she is having thoughts of suicide, you are not legally permitted, actually. It's under disabilities law to say the student can't be on campus, they need to go home. What you have to do is explain why you can't provide the care and support services that student needs under the circumstances that he or she finds him or herself. So simply, again, being a threat to oneself by virtue of having suicidal ideation does not permit you to remove a student from the campus, but there may be circumstances in which that's the prudent thing to do. What you need to do is go through a an assessment of the situation, what are the resources that you have, what are the needs of the student, and make a decision about what's in the best interest of that student under the circumstances. And if you do that, you will be running no risk of running afoul of this direction from the Office of Civil Rights. All right, so this slide just discusses that. Good idea for teams. You shouldn't have your decision-making driven too much by preset policies and procedures. What the Office of Civil Rights, who really look at Americans with Disabilities Act violation, and the Department of Education, which looks at FERPA kinds of issues, what everybody wants to see is that you've thought through particular situations using its own set of facts rather than just reacted in a kind of automatic way to problems. Okay, so we've talked about this. Obviously most of you, I assume, are not residential campuses, which does put you in a little bit more of a difficult position sometimes in knowing a lot about students. You're not with them where they're living. But you have to then look at who are the people on your school campuses who get to know and who have that personal interactions with students. Obviously, in many cases, lots of your students may be living with families, which can be an added resource, but also an added complication. So again, these are things that for you all sometimes will require some different kinds of thinking and approaches than schools that are primarily residential and in many cases more maybe self-contained. I know a lot of your schools also have very large numbers of students, and in that context, it is again challenging to have a good handle on what's going on with your students on campus. So just to sum up, when people care about each other and feel their institution cares about them, the odds of detecting someone who's emotionally disturbed and intervening before a tragedy occurs become much better. I always love that quote because I'm quoting myself at a comment I made at an earlier conference. So we have, I guess, about 7 or 8 minutes. And common pitfalls, really, I think we've talked about most of these things. Lack of preparation, not thinking through what your plan of managing the team, not having clear pathways and processes, focusing on reporting and getting information as an end rather than as just the beginning of a process of addressing problems, misunderstanding FERPA and HIPAA, looking at just looking towards mental illness instead of focusing on behaviors, and I think. Okay, again, relying on policies and procedures rather than looking at the case-by-case situation and not following up. These are, remember, dynamic events. You have to really follow a situation that has raised a concern until there's a plan that seems to have addressed the situation, or you become convinced that the situation just isn't a problem. Okay, team dynamics. We haven't talked about it all, but it's stressful and difficult to deal with these situations. So certainly the team leader needs to be thoughtful about how people are working, and trust is certainly central to the team being effective. People need to trust each other enough to disagree with each other. Okay, so I think we wound up pretty much taking the whole time. We have a couple minutes left, but I think I addressed all of the questions pretty much that were sent in. I know there was one question about, are there training programs for threat assessment? There are a number of different private companies that have begun to establish these kinds of things. You need to look at them very carefully and make sure that the people who are managing those are reasonable and experienced people, and that they're not simply trying to sell you all an expensive product again. Again, I don't want to either recommend or de-recommend anything specific, but, speak to your friends and colleagues who may have looked into some of these things and just try to get a handle on whether they thought a particular program was helpful or not. The appendix of the Virginia Tech report, again, has some very useful information around threat assessment. The one thing to be aware of is anybody who tells you that they have a model or survey or questionnaire that will allow you to predict violence in any kind of meaningful way. I'll be diplomatic and say you should be very cautious about that, because there's no scientific system out there that allows you to do that in any kind of predictable and orderly way. We know that there are some, risk factors and danger signs, but nobody's actually got a sort of dynamic model through any kind of screening tool that allows you to predict violence with any kind of meaningfulness or certainty. All right, so we're down just to a couple minutes, and if anybody has any final questions or thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear them, or read them, as the case may be. Okay, did someone just hop on or off? Okay. Anybody who wants to learn more about, I don't know if Nathan is asking about the JED Foundation, but jedfoundation.org, you can read about us and our programs on the website. In the minute or two remaining, I just want to let you all know that we've just released a new self-study program for college campuses called JED Campus, which you can read about at jedcampus.org. It really is developed to help campuses evaluate and assess and then get feedback from us on their programming around emotional and mental health. Campuses that have robust programs are eligible to get a JED Campus seal, which is kind of like a LEED seal, but our hope is that even campuses that are not in the ballpark to do that will be able to use the program as a way of helping them develop a strategic plan and think about how to maximize their resources and their efficiencies, and do the most they can with whatever resources that they have to support students and really develop as comprehensive a program as they possibly can. So check that out. We'd love for as many of you who are interested to participate. There is a $650 fee to participate in the program, but actually it's only partly covering our cost of running the program. So it's just helping us not to completely sink ourselves financially with the program. So hope that this was helpful and that that I was able to answer your questions.
All right, thank you, Vic. I really appreciate you taking the time, and everyone on the call, I hope you got something out of this. We will be archiving it if you need to come back. As a reminder, the Center for Applied Research Solutions offers no-cost training and technical assistance to all campuses. If you're interested in receiving assistance, visit our website, which is up on the screen now. And as you begin to log off and close out the webinar, there will be a short evaluation form that will pop up on your computer screen, and we would really appreciate it if you took a moment to complete it and provide us with your feedback. Again, thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon.